The following was recorded in front of a live studio audience at the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. This is the United Podcast Network.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Friends in Recovery podcast. My name is Mike Miles. I'm a clinical social worker. I have a private practice in Chelmsford, Massachusetts called Therapy Services. I'm also a licensed alcohol drug counselor and a retired police officer, City of Lowell for 35 years. And I'd like to welcome everyone to the show.
Thanks, Mike. Ed Chionchio from Genesis House. We also like to thank Genesis House for sponsoring us and making this possible. And I actually work for Genesis House. I do the outreach and marketing. I oversee all the marketers for Genesis House, and we try to help as many people as we can.
Jeff Zeizel, also a clinical social worker. I run a outpatient consulting practice, Center for Health Resources in Woburn. We do a lot of interventions, work with addiction, and interestingly enough, we work with the law enforcement community providing services for those who may have trauma and other related problems.
And I'm Mr. Jonathan, producer extraordinaire. You can find the Friends in Recovery podcast on iTunes, iHeartRadio, Podbean, or broadcast live right on YouTube every Tuesday at 4 p.m.
Thanks, Jonathan. One number I want to give out before we start is our hotline. We try to give it out as much as we could. If you can get a hold of us for any topic or any questions that you have, and you can call us at 800-989-6504. That's 800-989-6504, and we'll be giving that number out periodically, so you guys can jot that down and give us a call if you need anything.
Super. So we have a guest today. We have a live guest, and we're very fortunate to have him. This is Chief William Taylor to my left, and Chief Taylor was my boss for the last several years of my career, and he was kind enough to come on the program today. So, Chief, if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you very much, everybody, for the invitation to come here today. It's a very important topic, and hopefully we can help some people along the way. As Mike said, I'm the police chief, or we call it a superintendent, in the city of Lowell, Mass. About a city of about 110,000 people in northern Massachusetts, about 25 miles from Boston. And I've been a police officer there for approaching 36 plus years now. I've been there. I've been the chief for the last 4.5 years approximately there, and I've come up through the ranks. I've pretty much done every job in the department. I think what is maybe interesting to the topic that we're discussing here today is early on in my career, I spent approximately 11 years as a narcotics detective and supervisor in the city's narcotics unit back in the 80s and into the 90s in the city of Lowell, and working in various federal and state task forces in the general, Massachusetts area, Eastern Mass area. So hopefully we can have a good discussion.
I'm sure we will. And my first question actually would be along the lines of, I know what you did back in the 80s. I know Lowell was a mecca for heroin use and addiction, and a lot of crime went with that. And so I guess my question to you would be, as a chief of police now, and prior to being a young, detective working in a very robust and busy multicultural city, what's the correlation between the heroin addiction that you saw back then, and I know there were other drugs as well, and you can expand on that, and compared to where we are now with this opiate addiction?
Well, I think they're completely different. Back in the 80s and early 90s, it was the method of distribution was completely different. It was all street corner distribution, houses that were prevalent, and so people would deal drugs, either heroin or cocaine, from individual locations. So they'd have a corner, they'd have a house, things like that. Now the method of distribution has changed completely. It's all technology-based or digitally based. It's all based on some form of communication. They use cell phones now. They use encrypted apps to make those connections between the buyer and the seller. And that causes law enforcement a lot more difficulty today's day and age to try and surveil people that are dealing drugs and buying drugs. And so I think it's a much more difficult proposition. And I think what the general public doesn't see that they used to see is they used to be areas in all urban cities that were notorious with drug distribution. You take, for example, The Wire, the show The Wire, things like that. Now you don't see that as much because it's kind of behind the scenes. It's out of sight. A lot of times the deals take place in parking lots or in streets. They make those connections at literally a million different places across the area. So that has changed. The other thing that's changed drastically, a couple of really important things, is the price. So back in the 80s and 90s, it was a lot of heroin. When I was a very young detective with a lot of hair, I used
but still a good-looking guy.
Yeah, face that's made for radio. But when I did that back then, we were buying a single dosage unit of heroin for about $45 a bag back in, say, 1984. And the dosage unit was about 1/10 of a gram. So that's pretty consistent to today's day and age. The size of the portion is similar. What's not similar is the price and the purity. So back then it was $45 a dosage unit or a bag. That same size today is about $6 a bag. So the price has literally become incredibly cheap. And the purity level's gone up. Back then, the purity level was certainly below 50%. It was heroin mixed with some inert substances. Now that average purity level can be 70, 80, 90% street level distribution quantity. And so it's much purer, much, much, much cheaper. And the deals take place all based around communication technology and things like that.
It's pretty amazing. Chief, in the 80s, did you see a lot of not just heroin, but also cocaine being utilized?
Yeah. Yes. And so what's, I think, very interesting, people might find the difference is back in the 80s and 90s, there was the introduction of a lot of cocaine into this country, and certainly eastern Massachusetts was no different, and especially as the crack cocaine epidemic came, fully engulfed this area back in around 1988, 90 or so. And what we saw was a tremendous, tremendous, unprecedented increase in violence in many of the urban areas of this country. Certainly my community was no different.
Chief, talk the end users. I think the end users are different customers today also than it was all those years ago. Heroin is accessible by kids nowadays. I mean, high school kids. And do you see problems in high school with heroin and oxys or whatever the case is? Like I said, maybe the end users. What do they look like today versus all those years ago?
I think that the change that we see today is a couple of things. First of all, is the typical user now that ends up addicted to opiates, and then very quickly there's a curve that the people that study this can very articulately explain how it plays out. But when they get to the point where they have to sustain their addiction with street-level narcotics, typically the way that the people that we see today get involved and get introduced into that pipeline is through pharmaceutical or prescription opiates. And they either have an orthopedic injury, they very often have some kind of a chronic illness or disease. They start on opiates, prescription opiates, and then they're very frequently prescribed way too many of them by the medical community, or they just very quickly become addicted. And then what we see is that when eventually those prescription opiates dry up, the doctors catch on, or they can't doctor shop anymore because of some other changes that have taken place, they migrate over to black market opiate pills, right? Percocets, Vicodin, things like that. And then those are very expensive. They're more difficult to get. So that period of time where they change from legal prescription opiates to the black market prescription opiates is relatively short. And then they quickly seem to go to street-level narcotics, heroin and increasingly fentanyl.
Which is extremely, like you said, is extremely more pure now than it was, so they get addicted.
And cheap.
Yeah, and cheap.
Right.
Yeah. I noticed that changeover. I've been doing this a long time. I've been working in the field for 20 years, give or take. But about 10 years ago, give or take, I was noticing house moms coming in. I was noticing younger kids coming into treatment, all due to heroin. And I'm thinking, like, this is really weird. But it's because exactly what you said is it's these doctors. They're going to the doctors getting what they can, and when they can't get it, then they turn to the street drug. So it's a different end user, like I said before, that we're looking at. So,
Chief, do you see, like, from your office, and I know you have a great staff underneath you, and by the time people get to you, they've gone through like kind of a chain of command, even if they're not in a paramilitary organization like the police department. But like, do mothers call you? Do priests call you? Rabbis? Do people call you and say, "Hey, Billy or Chief, we're going to need some help here"? Do you get individual calls like that? And if you do, how do you handle those? I mean, it's got to be heartfelt sometimes.
The only way I can describe it is heart-wrenching. It breaks your heart when you hear these stories. I know personal stories of people that have been close to me. I know stories that this individual, Mike, this woman in our community has taken a very proactive approach, opened houses in the city. Her son that succumbed to this opiate addiction, died from an overdose, played hockey with my son, for years. And I knew her. And then when you realize, what happened, and you see the grief that it has resulted to the family and everything, the consequences, it really breaks your heart. It absolutely does.
It's interesting because, Chief, what you were saying back in the day, as Mike was alluding to, the average user was sort of an inner city kid, probably disenfranchised, impoverished, etc., of all ethnicities. And as we have evolved, we see that it's the middle class kids. It's the kids who who go to college and high school and they play sports and so on. But it is interesting how the price of the drug has gone down dramatically. So if you think about $1988 at $45 a bag versus $5 to $10 a bag in 2018. It's remarkably inexpensive, and I think actually so I happen to be the clinician for the Drug Enforcement Administration as well, and what they have said was that the cocaine cartels in the 80s were remarkably profitable, but they also realized that growing a hectare of land to grow coca plants to make cocaine only produce 10% if you have the same equivalent of opium. So opium plantations from Afghanistan, the sort of masterminds of the agricultural piece, they brought over the Afghanis to plant the agricultural crops of opiums in Colombia, where they produce 10 times the yield, which is why it's a supply and demand. It's basic economics. The supply is so plentiful and the demand is high. The price is actually cheaper now. And unfortunately, we see what has happened, and it is heartbreaking because you see these fine people who have a disease and it doesn't end well.
Yeah,
no, it doesn't end well.
And on Mike's question, Chief, what does your officers do? Is my thing is. Does jail work? Throwing these kids into jail and letting them kick in jail versus get them to a detox, maybe mandatory treatment. I don't know if we're seeing that going somewhere, helping these kids out. I like getting involved with the families. The families are very, very important in recovery to help that person get recovery. But throwing somebody in jail to me doesn't seem like that's going to work. Obviously, they're breaking the law by possessing this stuff. But is that really the answer? And if I'm putting it in a spot, I'm sorry.
No,
but,
I've been asked this question many times, and I think most law enforcement agencies, and certainly us, I think is a leader among those, have had a transformation. And we realized that this problem has to be dealt with a more complicated, multifaceted way to approach it. And so let me tell you a little story. Back in 2015, we started to experience literally an astronomical body count in my city from the opiate epidemic. And that really, the game changer to this whole equation has been fentanyl. Right?
Yes.
I think everybody in a position of treatment or law enforcement will tell you fentanyl has been the game changer.
Yeah.
And the way the fentanyl plays out is it's manufactured very, very inexpensively, mostly in China. It's shipped either to Mexico or, in some cases, the United States. It's either combined with some heroin or increasingly shipped in place of heroin as heroin. The problem is it's 50 to 100 times more potent than heroin. And so these people that are addicted to the drug, literally every time they use, it's a crapshoot.
Mm-hmm.
Much more so than it used to be.
Okay.
So we started to see the body count rising astronomically, the devastation that it was causing in our communities and our family members. And I had a enlightening experience that happened to me in October of 2016. I responded to an opiate overdose in a homeless camp in the city. What was so amazing about it was how atypical it was. It was just another opiate overdose with fatal consequences. It was a young man, died, squalid conditions, was living in a homeless setup, terrible conditions. A woman that was nearby, and then different homeless setup, came over and was talking to us about it and told us that this individual was trying to get an appointment to get some medically assisted treatment, Suboxone, but he couldn't get the appointment. He was a few weeks away from an appointment with a local physician, and he didn't make it. So I came back. And this was really when the gravity of this epidemic was striking me personally and many people in our community. A couple of days goes by. One of my deputies, Deputy Deb Friedel, did some research. She found this young man's obituary on a local funeral home. And so you read it, and what was striking was this individual, just like my son, our sons, he grew up in a neighboring community, 28 years old. If you read the obituary, you certainly would come to the conclusion that the family struggled. They tried to help him. He was a normal high school kid, played sports, went to high school. He got out of high school, served in the National Guard, did a deployment, served his country, and he came back. However, it manifested itself that he became addicted. He ended up like that, and he couldn't get the help he was needed. So it caused us to, not that by itself, but that was probably the thing that drove us, me personally, and the department to develop an outreach program where we said we have to do more. We have to try and help people get into treatment. And so we developed we call a community opioid outreach program in the city. And we did it with just a police officer that was inclined to help people, somebody from Lowell House, who's a treatment facility in Lowell, and then it grew from there. So now what we do is we go out and we identify individuals that have overdosed and survived. We have 2 to 3 of them almost every day in the city of Lowell. And they take that data that we have internally, they go out and find these individuals that need our assistance. And they do everything they can to partner with various treatment agencies in the area to see if we can assist them into treatment. We call it push, pull, drag, encourage, whatever we can do. And it's all focused on the idea to see if we can stop that cycle and get them into treatment and save their lives.
Right. And, I think what's important to, of course, as recovering alcoholic addict, if you don't want the help, and a lot of people that are even living under bridges, and you look and your heart breaks because these people have the clothes on their back. They might have a couple of plastic bags with a few things in them, but basically they're living outside. They're going to the shelter to eat, and if you approach them, and I did it many years as a cop, and try to get them help. They'd shy away. And it's not because I don't think it was the stigma of the cop trying to help. I just think they didn't want help. And that's heartbreaking in and of itself. But as we know, if somebody doesn't want help, they're not going to take help. Yeah. And I think what's important, what I've seen anyway over the years, is that with policing, I think a lot of people don't understand that, we are we're more than just cops. We're medical people. We're first responders. We're teachers sometimes. We're social workers.
Friends. You guys are friends.
We're a lot of things. It's not just about cuff them up and take them away. Those days are long gone. But what do you think of the Narcan? Isn't there a new law, Chief? Not a new law, but isn't there a bill they're trying to put through now where if somebody is Narcaned or receives some professional help from a department like EMS department, isn't there a bill, I think, in the House right now they're trying to put through to get them help or
mandate some
treatment?
Could you talk on that, please?
So we have Narcan everywhere in the community. Every one of our police vehicles, fire apparatus, obviously EMS has it. Every one of our officers has been trained on it. We have it, everywhere. And What I can tell you is everyone that we have recently gotten to that's a witnessed overdose, that somebody calls us and we help, we administer Narcan, us, the fire department, EMS, we save, right? The people that we don't save, unfortunately, are the ones that are not with other people when they overdose. They don't call us.
You know, it's interesting,
It's amazing.
I just want to comment. The model that you described is a beautiful model. I mean, you have saved people's lives by saying, not just, let's just do the follow-up. You know, let's not just Narcan them, let's follow them up so we know that they can get some assistance. And that's sort of the critical piece. You know, the opioid epidemic is so dramatic. 64,000 people have died the past year in the United States. And, you know, in Massachusetts, it's approximately 6 deaths per day. So 64,000 deaths in 1 year, that's more than Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and the World Trade Centers combined. So what you're doing is, you know, you really make a dramatic difference in saving people's lives. So that's, you know, more credit to your department.
Yeah.
If we didn't have Narcan, the death toll would be much higher.
Oh yeah. We're experienced, and I'm sure you guys see this, that you find Narcan and that's my soapbox. I feel that if you're Narcan by a first responder who's out there working for the community, I believe they should have mandatory treatment. I mean, you're a civil servant, you get paid by the people, and the Narcan is paid by us. Shouldn't there be something mandatory that if you get Narcan, they should go into treatment? I mean, the perfect world would be great because, but who's going to pay for it? Number one. Number two, they have to want it. But it's almost like suicide. You're sticking a needle in your arm. You were saying before, you don't know what you're going to get. Now, what's the difference of taking a gun, putting it to your head, and pulling the trigger? You know what you're going to get. You don't know what you're going to get in that needle. So hopefully there's something out there. Maybe we can get them under a behavioral health issue or something where they can go into treatment after their Narcan. A 30-day mandatory treatment after you get hit by Narcan.
It would be, I think, beneficial, right? I think you'd have to have a lot more beds.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Currently, the law is, what we do is if we revive somebody from an overdose, they're mandated to at least go to the hospital.
Okay.
Now, we do that, obviously, every police department or first responders do in Massachusetts, get to the hospital. Quite candidly, very often they're out the door very quickly.
Yeah.
So it's an insidious disease, as we know, and the addictive properties of opiates are probably the most devastating I've seen, right? I think I know there's all kinds of addictions, and people can be addicted to smartphones and everything on down the line, right?
Yeah.
Cigars,
whatever it may be. But in all,
I disagree with that statement.
Yes.
But in all seriousness, this particular form of addiction, I think, is probably some of the most detrimental I've seen in my career. It's devastating. And I think the other thing that I want to mention about Pete real quickly is so that we do we try and get people into treatment. We're trying everything we can. At the same time, I think this is very important from a law enforcement perspective. The people that are profiting off this, not users, not users, but the people that are making money off the destruction of our families and our communities, I think they need to be prosecuted to the fullest extent possible because they're the parasites here. Yep. They are responsible for a lot of this, right? Now, I know it's a personal choice thing, but they're making money off destroying our communities, and we have to go after them.
Mike, slide your mic up just a little bit.
There you go. How do you find those people? I mean, I'm sure you and Mike have that. I mean, I don't want you don't have to reveal your secrets, but absolutely, those people. Most of I seen a show on 2020 or whatever. Most of those drug dealers don't even use drugs.
That's right.
They just make money off these kids, and they're killing our kids.
Exactly right. But it's interesting. The drugs are so powerful that people get Narcan, and to your point, Chief, they go to the ER. Sometimes they're released and they're Narcan again in the same evening.
Yeah,
so the question that Mike had asked was, is there any legislation or bills being passed? So Governor Baker in Massachusetts suggested that we have a 72-hour holding period for those who are Narcan to determine their dangerousness to themselves and others. One can argue anyone who's shooting up heroin is automatically dangerous to themselves because we know, the high rate of potential, overdose and death.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I think, excuse me, this past administration, the past 8 years or 9 years, but anyway, the past administration, it seems like there was a lot of, towards the end of the administration, it seems like there was a lot of people being let out of jail for, that had been drug dealers, high-end drug dealers. And I guess if you're talking about marijuana and you got 20 years for selling 10 pounds of marijuana, and that's just a fictitious amount I'm bringing up, I can understand that. But I really think that what you just said is so true. There are people out there that have no responsibility. If nobody catches them, they're doing what they want. But when they do get caught, it's almost like what I've seen over the years, and I had some pretty good arrests as a younger guy. I arrested a guy one time. He had 2.75 pounds of cocaine in his car, and he had a shotgun, and he had 100 Valiums, and he had about $4,000 in cash. And it was a big case, and I had to lug the stuff down to court and back and forth and sign it in, sign it out. And honestly, his punishment was he had to write a 5,000-word composition. It's a true story.
Oh my God!
This guy had a book. He had a little black book with figures of owes 180,000, owes 45,000. This was a major drug dealer. His lawyer at the time, I won't mention the lawyer's name, very good lawyer, obviously, 5,000 word composition. And Captain Newell at the time, he was a sergeant, lieutenant. He had gone down to court with me that day when the sentence was given out, and it was just amazing to me what you saw. And I think people are higher up in the political world. They don't understand it unless they have it themselves. And I think what's really happening now, as we know in the last 5-6 years, it is suburban America now. It's not just the inner city. Mm-hmm. So maybe there'll be a change. But I think in the meantime, I think the laws have to be a lot stronger.
It really has to require a multifaceted approach. So it's law enforcement, it's interdiction, it's treatment, as you have pointed out, Chief, treatment beds to be available. It's education. It's getting to the kids in the school. It's teaching doctors not to prescribe. It's having consequences from the DEA that if you overprescribe, you should lose your license or be required to have a suspension and then get education. And maybe take those doctors who are overprescribing to the morgues where these kids are dying because of what they started. Yeah. It also requires tremendous money from Congress. So in the Trump administration, at the beginning of the administration, he said we're going to have a war on opiates. Congress, in the beginning of February, has authorized $6 billion to provide more additional funding for treatment. The difficulty, if you ask the experts, it requires 25 times that amount. So we're looking at probably $130, $150 billion to address this issue. Interestingly enough, because the opioid epidemic is so significant, the average life expectancy of an American for the last 2 years has gone down. We're the richest country in the world and have had tremendous sort of success and wealth, and our life expectancy is going down because of the opioid epidemic.
And I have had the opportunity to view the same data, and the experts tell us that it's almost single-handedly attributed to the opioid epidemic.
And I think
exactly right.
I think the opioid epidemic surpassed heart attacks and all. I think that's the number one killer of our younger
that's right,
folks.
Exactly right.
I mean, I'm not a statistic person.
In fact, the average age of a Caucasian man has dropped significantly because we used to think of the heroin as an inner city problem where people of color would die. It's not that way anymore. It's universal. And statistically, it's mostly white males and white females, and of course, people of color and so on. Ohio has had dramatic incidents of overdoses. It's like destroyed communities. I mean, and people are having babies born addicted, et cetera. And one of the concerns in the law enforcement community now is that, in the old days, you would do a raid. You brick the door, you have some maybe dogs, and all of a sudden there's a table of drugs that get knocked over, and it's fentanyl. Fentanyl goes in the air, and there was a case I believe it was in Columbus, Ohio, where 10 or 11 police officers were doing a raid, and they all overdosed because of the fentanyl in the air.
So we've had to the fentanyl is so strong now that we've had to increase our dosage that we carry from 2 milligrams to 4. So now we have 4 milligrams.
Oh, the Narcan?
Wow, the Narcan. I'm sorry. Yeah. So the Narcan, we've increased the strength of the drug to counteract the opiates, the fentanyl. Yeah. So, but we also have to carry. We all carry now two dosage. We carry for the victim and also for the first responder.
That's
in
incredible.
case of accidental overdose.
Have you seen any carfentanil in the city of Lowell?
We've been fortunate. We have not. It's in the general Eastern Mass area at a few spots. The interesting about the carfentanil is it seems to be mostly brought in using the dark web. So it comes, they purchase it on this alternate web traffic, and then it's brought in many times using the mail. And so it kind of bypasses a normal distribution chain. But it's, if you can think it's more dangerous than fentanyl, it actually is.
Right. Carfentanil, just may I jump in, 10,000 times stronger than fentanyl. 10,000. It will kill people like that. And there's no bringing them back.
And the Narcan doesn't work on it
Exactly.
either, from what I was told.
Well, I don't know that,
Okay.
but I know it's very dangerous.
Yeah.
Well, you know what I see from and I'm sure Jeff does too, and from a therapeutic point of view is that you have people come in that used to. I've been doing this 18 years. Jeff's been double that, but people.
I started when I was 10.
Yeah, exactly. People would come in with an addiction to alcohol or to cocaine, or even parents bringing their young teen boys and girls, mostly boys, for marijuana use. But the opioid addiction is so powerful. It's not just a physical addiction; it's an emotional addiction. It's a psychological addiction. It's so hard to get away from, and I just feel like there's like one or two doctors in the area that really have some knowledge about recovery. There's a guy up at Chelmsford, Dr. O'Connell. He's in Courthouse Lane, the same office park I'm in, and I think he was an obstetrician. I'm pretty sure, and he gave up that practice to get a hold of this epidemic and help, and he get trained in it. And he does the Suboxone, and he does the Vivitrol, and he does he doesn't do methadone, but all those drugs that are available now, I'm sure there could be other drugs that would be available if Lilly and all these big drug companies got together and they could figure out something to take the scariness, the pressure, the depression that goes with addiction. I mean, people do try, and they'll go 3 or 4 days, a week, 2 weeks, and then boom, they're right back at it because they just can't live within their own skin. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a real common cause for people to go back out there again and start all over again.
Well, like you're saying, Mike, this drug is so powerful. We put them into treatment. 30 days later, they're out without any kind. I was never for the Suboxone or any kind of medically assisted treatment. But you put these kids out there after treatment, after 30, 40 days in treatment, they use again and they die. Right. So,
they're more susceptible.
Yeah, they are.
Fatal overdose.
Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly right.
Yeah. And one thing real quick, I want to give out the 800 number. It's 800-989-6504 for all the family members or anybody who has questions for any of us up here in the panel. We can help you guys out as far as that goes.
So I'll just mention, though, it's not all doom and gloom, right? Because, and I think we have to make sure as community leaders that we get the message out that there's a hope, there's a template that we can use moving forward here, and it's in large measure what we've all done in this country about cigarettes, right? Tobacco use, and so we kind of can use that as a general template to move forward. We treat the people that need our assistance, like I talked to you about, the addicts that are currently involved. We, somewhat different than tobacco, but we go after the people that are motivated by greed and profiting from this, and then at the same time, increasingly heavy emphasis on education. Yeah. That's ultimately going to be the solution here, or the savior down the line, is while we deal with the people that we have now and get them help, go after the individuals that are profiting, we have to start intensive, age-appropriate, but at extremely young ages, education, so that we make sure that, we tell people the truth about these opiate drugs and how dangerous and careful they have to be when they're growing up.
Absolutely. And for the family members out there, Chief, what can they do? Like if they see their loved one using, or living in a tent or whatever, what do they have to do? I mean, what can they call? What do they do? Like, what's some of their repercussions or some of their the help that they can get?
Well, I think the best resource that I've heard family members talk to me about is either locally in the Lowell area, there's a group called Learn to Cope that helps people that are either lost a loved one or need a loved one to get into recovery, and they help. They provide support for the family members. There's always Al-Anon and the different components to that, where they help guide people and family members as they struggle with a loved one with an addiction. It's a long road. It's not easy. I think we all would be inclined. You'd never give up on a family member. I'm certainly, that's the right thing to do, but you have to do it with a sense of realism of what the battle is you're about to face.
Yeah. Chief, I like what you said that, it's not all doom and gloom. So what do we know about addiction? It's treatable. People recover. Right. Sometimes it's a miracle. Some people you never expect to get there. Some people you think will get there, perhaps they don't. But, it's important that we have optimism. It is a treatable disorder, and people can get help. We know that the average recovery window, someone who's been using opiates for 9 years or so, statistically, at the end of that window, they seem to have recovery. So we know that if people, can live long enough, they can actually get into recovery. And many people, unfortunately, don't make it. I like what you had said earlier about medical-assisted treatment. Ed, you were sort of inferring that, it's nice for folks to be drug-free, but sometimes they don't have, some people just can't make it. Because what do we know about addiction? It's a brain disorder. And one's addiction is so powerful sometimes that it's better that we put them on Suboxone or Methadone, because it's what we refer to as, less harmful ways, where they're not going to die of an overdose. At least they can be in treatment, perhaps get better and get off of it and so on.
That's right. And so we have a very innovative sheriff in Middlesex County, Sheriff Katusian, and he's providing inmates that are getting released from a house of correction setting, which is a short-term incarceration area typically. And so they know that some interesting statistics, most of the individuals that get incarcerated in the house of correction have substance abuse problems, right? The vast majority.
By 80%.
80%. And of those people that they test, 80% of them have fentanyl in their system, right? Amazing. So it's the game changer, right?
It is.
And so what he's providing is Vivitrol shots to them when they leave. It gives them a 30-day cushion, and then there's, processes by which they can extend that.
That's money well spent. Those shots are probably $1,000 to $1,400 per shot. But that's the most effective bang for your buck, because these people aren't dying. And what's the cost of reviving someone who's on fentanyl? I don't know what the department pays for fentanyl. For Narcan. If you have a line item in your budget, it's probably remarkably expensive.
Oh, if you looked at the continuum of care from the first responders, the Narcan, and then the associated hospital treatment.
Yeah, it's tens of thousands.
No question. And then the disruption to the family. So anything we can do to help people stay out of jail. Right. Addicts, I think we all understand, addicts, generally speaking, don't belong in jail. That's not going to facilitate that. But, they need to get help. We need to push them down that treatment track.
Jail also could be a good motivator for somebody to get clean. Well, nobody wants to sit in a cell and kick. I know a lot of families that I work with that say
the best thing that happened was he got arrested.
He got arrested, and should we get him out? No, leave him in there. Let him think what he or she's doing, and then give him the choice. You can stay or you can go into treatment, and it's a great motivator. But once they're out and in treatment again, like I said, they want to come back out and use again. So Vivitrol and methadone and Suboxone, I think, is a good temporary help, like I don't want to say crutch,
harm reduction model.
Harm reduction model, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Well, I think too. Ed had mentioned earlier in the program about law enforcement and their involvement in jail just shouldn't be the answer. And I think a lot of people are on board, and I work with a lot of addicts that are on probation that have to go to a probation officer. They have to be tested, urine tested weekly, bi-weekly sometimes, which is good. And that's where my success rate really does kick in. I'm not sure about yours, Jeff, but I do see somebody that has to be tested, that has to be accountable. Usually, they don't want to go to jail. They might want to help in spite of what their body or mind are telling them about, let's get high. And I think that's very useful. And my point is that corrections, the sheriff, incredible strides to help so many people. I go to that HEAT conference out in Woburn, Jeff, you and I have
Vinnie
talked to.
Perro, Woburn District Court.
Yes, and I mean these are court officers. They give their heart and soul. All the people that work there, and the sheriff has spoken there a couple times, keynote speaker, and heartfelt speeches. I mean, emotional speeches about people he knows, and his heart's in the right place. You can see it, and I think it's just so important now. It's just not like it used to be with the probation in the courts. They were in 8 to 4. They were out the door. No, they make home visits now. They do a lot. They're involved in this. They're really, really involved. And I really think that plays a component where recovery is a possibility in spite of the addict that might not want to get sober.
Yeah.
I think one of the reasons that happens is everyone knows someone now who's been impacted by it.
Right.
Years ago, no one knew anyone. And you can go to a room and say, raise your hand if you know someone who suffers from this disorder. And there's lots of people. Interestingly, it's one of the things I've been seeing as a clinician, because I work with the law enforcement community with many departments. There are many police officers who are now suffering from PTSD because they're just finding one dead kid after another.
Yeah.
And that takes a toll on the law enforcement community. In fact, there was this month's issue of Time Magazine, the first time in the 95 years of Time Magazine, the whole story, the whole issue was dedicated. It was a photo essay of the opioid crisis in America. They had a reporter and a photographer who's a war photographer, a veteran of many, many wars, Somalia, Afghanistan. He was at the World Trade Center, James Nachi, and he photographed around the United States of all these sort of terrible things. And he reported on a Captain Bill Merriweather out of New Mexico, who was so traumatized. He saw so many of these people dying, and it created such a heartfelt reaction. And then it turns out his 22-year-old daughter overdosed and died. Mm-hmm. He couldn't even help his daughter. And just the trauma that the first responders experience is pretty dramatic.
Yeah,
certainly.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're winding down here, and I don't know if anyone has any more questions for the chief.
Chief, well, thank you very much for coming on. We really appreciate it. It's a great guest to have. One last time with that phone number, 800-989-6504 is the number that you can reach any of us. If you have any questions about anything we spoke about today or past shows, you can reach us at 800-989-6504. And Mike, next week our guest is going to be Kevin Dixon from KD Consultants. He's an interventionist. He's a great guy, and he's shed a little more light on how we can help the guys that are getting arrested or whatever. Kevin's a great
advocate
resource.
For help. Yes, he is, and he's pretty well known across the country.
Yes, he is.
Chief, I want to thank you again.
Thank you very much.
Chief, thank you for taking your time. We appreciate it.
Nice job.
Thank you.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts, guests, or callers of this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, the United Podcast Network, its partners, or affiliates.